Marie is 52 years old that morning. She walks into a funeral home in Paris, holding the hand of her 19-year-old daughter, who is trembling beside her. Her husband, Patrick, died last night of a heart attack at the age of 54 in their bedroom. She hasn't slept, hasn't eaten anything since 6 p.m., and in the next 30 minutes, she'll have to sign an estimate she won't understand. Neither the numbers nor the options, because she's never buried anyone in her life. The funeral director is calm, gentle, and professional. He shows her a catalog with photos of coffins, descriptions of ceremonies, and memorial stonework options. Marie nods without really listening because she's still thinking about Patrick, who was drinking his coffee at 7 a.m. yesterday morning. 3 days later, the bill arrives in her mailbox. 6,480 euros. What she doesn't know is that the coffin she chose because it was dignified and simple was billed to her at 1,800 euros, while the same model was purchased by the funeral home for less than 250 euros.
The funeral business represents more than 5 billion euros in annual revenue. And for death industry professionals, the future looks bright. Every year in France, about 540,000 people pass away. In 30 years, there will be more than 700,000. A booming market that constantly juggles two taboos, death and money.
And behind every line on Marie's bill, there's a perfectly tuned economic system that has been thriving for 30 years. The French funeral services market is worth more than 3 billion euros in 2024, with 650,000 deaths per year. And this number keeps increasing because the population is aging rapidly, with 3,000 to 4,000 additional deaths each year, according to INSEE. But a much darker reality lies beneath this surface. Two financial groups alone control 30% of the market, and prices are so opaque that no one really knows how much a funeral actually costs before signing. How could such a sensitive business turn into a cash machine without raising any concerns? Who are the real beneficiaries, and how far can this system still go? The American economist George Arkeloff, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001, theorized as early as 1970 a mechanism that explains why certain markets become pathological: information asymmetry. We'll come back to this in detail later, because it will help us better understand what's at stake here. Hi, Entrepreneur Mindset. I hope you're doing well. Today, we're diving behind the scenes of one of the most taboo businesses in France, a business that most of us will end up financing one day. It's a story of the methodical exploitation of grief, financial cynicism, and investment funds that have been getting rich off the deaths of our loved ones for 30 years. Before we start, just a reminder, you can find this episode as a podcast on all platforms. The link is in the description or through the QR code that's displayed. Our story begins in 1993. That year, the sewer law ended the municipal monopoly on funeral services with a simple promise: to open the market to competition in order to lower prices and give families more freedom. Except what actually happened was exactly the opposite. 30 years later, private funeral homes handle between 85 and 90% of funerals in France. And instead of going down, as you might guess, prices have skyrocketed. According to official figures from the National Funeral Federation, two groups alone control 30% of the market. OGF, which owns PFG, Roblo, and Henri de Bourneul, and Funacap. Alongside them, independent operators survive without any bargaining power against these two giants. How could opening up to competition have resulted in an oligopoly and skyrocketing prices? The answer comes down to 3 words: the captive customer. Imagine for a second when buying a car, you can take 2 months, compare 10 dealerships, negotiate the price, and read reviews online. But to bury your father, you have 48 hours, you're in shock. And nobody wants to get 3 quotes at a time like that. And it's exactly this emotional vulnerability that Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner in economics in 2002, spent his entire career studying. His work showed that under intense emotional stress, the human brain switches to what he calls System 1, a fast and intuitive decision-making mode that completely deactivates System 2, the rational analysis mode. In practical terms, a grieving person who has to choose a coffin within 30 minutes of being told about the death isn't really making a decision. They're just enduring the situation. And funeral advisors are trained to take advantage of this mechanism. They greet you kindly, speak gently, then open a catalog in a carefully chosen order. Expensive coffins are displayed first with polished photos and phrases like, "a dignified final tribute," while cheaper ones are at the bottom, making them seem less respectful. A commercial setup that is meticulously designed to exploit your guilt. And most families sign because you don't bargain over the death of a loved one. But what no one suspects is the indecent scale of the margins this system makes possible. Behind the flowers, the dark suits, and the gentle words, there's a machine, a business model based on a simple idea, turning every step of mourning into a billable item. Let's break down an average funeral in France, which costs between 4,500 euros for a traditional burial and 3,900 euros for a cremation, according to 2024 figures published by the main players in the industry. The coffin is the first major expense, averaging 688 euros for a standard model, but it can go up to 4,000 euros for high-end models. The secret behind this margin is sourcing. Basically, on European B2B platforms like Europage or Alibaba, where French funeral homes can buy wooden coffins made in Poland or Romania, prices start at 145 euros and rarely exceed 300 euros. That means a gross margin that can reach 1,000 euros on high-end models, without any material added value to justify this difference. Next comes the tombstone, which costs 2,000 to 6,000 euros depending on the model. The raw stone, mostly imported from China and India, costs only a fraction of the final sale price. The flowers, the transportation of the body, the burial tax, the ceremony fees, the mandatory police fees, everything is billed and everything is presented as essential. And this is exactly where we come back to the name I mentioned in the introduction, Georges Aquilev. His theory of information asymmetry mathematically demonstrates that in a market where the seller knows infinitely more than the buyer, and where the buyer has neither the time nor the energy to investigate, prices skyrocket without any connection to the real value of the product. The French funeral industry may be the purest information asymmetry market modern economics has ever produced. But the most profitable secret of this business isn't found in the bill for the day of the funeral, but in a much more discreet product, which brings in more than all the coffins in the world combined: funeral pre-arrangement plans. According to Credoc 2024 figures, funeral insurance contributions have exceeded 1.6 billion euros in France. The principle sounds like a good idea on paper. You pay 30 to 50 euros a month for 20 years. You do this to spare your loved ones the funeral costs, with insurance paying about 4,500 euros for your funeral. Except that in 20 years at 40 euros a month, you will have paid 9,600 euros to get 4,500 euros back in the end. The difference is the insurer's gross margin, who also grew your money in the stock market for 20 years. The stroke of genius is that the sector's two giants now control the entire chain. They direct you to their partner's insurance contract, collect commissions for 20 years, and finally handle your burial through their own funeral home. The customer pays 3 times: the contract, the investment, and the burial. And behind this perfectly oiled machine, there are shareholders demanding returns. OGF was bought in 2007 by the investment fund Astor Partners, then in 2013 by Pamplona Capital Management, and since 2017, the Canadian pension fund Ontario Teachers has become the majority shareholder with 74%. The French family business has become a financial asset managed from Toronto. But this system, as perfect as it may seem, hides a scandal so huge that when it broke, it almost destroyed the entire OGF empire. It's April 2020. France has been in lockdown for 3 weeks. COVID is hitting hard, hospitals are overwhelmed, and morgues are overflowing. Faced with the emergency, the prefecture of Val-de-Marne urgently requisitions a warehouse at the Rungus market to turn it into a giant temporary morgue and entrusts the logistical management to a single company, OGF.
In Marseille, hospital morgues are already full, and there is talk of using ice rinks or refrigerated trucks to store bodies.
Over 3 weeks, more than 1,300 bodies will pass through this warehouse. And that's where OGF does something that will trigger a national scandal. The company charges families 55 euros for 1 hour to pay their respects in front of their loved one's coffin. You just lost your father to COVID in the hospital. You couldn't say goodbye because visits had been banned for 3 weeks. And now you're being asked to pay 55 euros per hour to say your farewells in a warehouse in Rungus that was lent for free by the French Republic. When Mediapart reveals the case at the end of April 2020, and the French Federation of Cremation publicly denounces these practices, OGF will defend itself by talking about overhead costs, but the damage is done, and the omerta has just started to crack. And this scandal is only the tip of the iceberg. In 2000 and 2004, the Competition Authority had already sanctioned PGF, which became OGF, for anti-competitive collusion aimed at preventing others from setting up in certain departments. In 2018, France Inter exposed that some funeral homes illegally paid commissions to hospitals and nursing homes for staff to quietly recommend their services to grieving families. The French death business has become just another financial asset, managed by foreign funds that have never seen a coffin in their lives. And meanwhile, millions of husbands continue to sign 6,000 euro estimates without knowing they're enriching shareholders on the other side of the world. But what these funds hadn't anticipated is that the French are finally starting to wake up. Something is changing in France, and the investment funds behind the death business are feeling it. The first blow comes from a major cultural shift. Cremation, which accounted for barely 1% of funerals in 1980, now makes up about 45% of funerals in France, according to the latest Zerfi studies. And the 50% mark will be crossed before 2030. You're probably wondering why this is a problem for OGF and FundCap. Well, it's simple. A cremation costs on average 600 to 800 euros, less than a traditional burial, according to figures provided by Pompe Funèbre de France. No stonework, no headstone, or cemetery plot. Each additional cremation directly eats into the profitability of the industry's giants. The second blow comes from transparency. Online comparison sites like Meilleur Pompe Funèbre or Obsèque Info now allow families to compare prices between agencies before signing. Still a minority in 2024, but growing rapidly. And every family that compares before signing is a family that negotiates instead of just accepting. New players are also entering the market with a direct approach. Roche-Roqueclair bases his brand on affordable funeral services and is gaining market share. But the real shift is the cultural evolution of the French. According to a 2024 Credoc study, 49% of people aged 40 and over have already left or plan to leave instructions for their own funerals. The new generations are starting to dare to talk about money when it comes to funerals, to prepare their own funerals while still alive, and to refuse the 4,000 euro coffin they're pressured to sign for in 30 minutes. OGF and FundCap know this. And they are now investing heavily in communication, the appearance of transparency, and diversifying their offerings. But the challenge is immense. A business built on captive customers for 30 years can't reinvent itself in just 2 years. Economic history teaches us one formidable thing. All captive markets eventually open up, without exception. It happened to the telephone industry in 1998 when Free arrived and cut prices by 2/3 in just a few years. It happened to banks with the revolution of neobanks. And that's exactly what's happening now to the funeral business in France. The real lesson from this story for any entrepreneur is that a business based on the customer's vulnerability is always fragile in the long run. Not just because it's immoral, but because the customer always ends up regaining their power sooner or later, through transparency, competition, or cultural evolution. And exploiting someone else's vulnerability is never a sustainable strategy, as a certain billionaire from Bordeaux discovered when he bought Gosport for a symbolic €1 before hollowing it out from within, and eventually got caught years later, as shown in the video that's appearing.